Sam Altman didn't build OpenAI to democratize intelligence. He built it to colonize it. That is the core argument of Empire of AI by Karen Hao, which we are decoding today on Nonfiction Insights.
And right out of the gate, that is an incredibly heavy claim to make about the company that effectively kicked off this entire era of tech. You know, usually when we talk about OpenAI or ChatGPT, the debate is super technical. It's about hallucination rates or whether it's going to replace junior coders. But Karen Howe is doing something completely different here. She's arguing that we aren't actually witnessing a tech revolution at all, but rather a geopolitical power grab that is just disguised as software.
Exactly. And to understand that power grab, you really have to look past the chatbot. You have to look at the underlying infrastructure. Howe's core thesis is that OpenAI functions as a modern imperial model. She argues they are structurally replicating the exact behaviors of the British East India Company.
Okay, I have to stop you right there. I am definitely playing the skeptic today because calling a San Francisco software company imperial just feels like a massive academic stretch. I mean, the East India Company had literal standing armies. They conquered Bengal. They levied taxes. Sam Altman runs a company that sells $20 subscriptions, so I don't have to write my own cover letters. Is this imperial label just a dramatic metaphor for successful capitalism, or is she pointing to actual evidence of colonial behavior?
It is absolutely not a metaphor. That is the most important thing to grasp about this deep dive. Hami is using empire as a clinical, structural definition of how this entity acquires its resources. And to see why, you have to look at what she calls the bait and switch. This is their foundational move. Think back to 2015 when OpenAI launched. They started as a nonprofit. Their stated mission was to build artificial general intelligence AGI that benefits all of humanity, completely unconstrained by the need to generate financial returns.
Right. They were heavily publicized as the open source good guys, the ethical counterweight to Google's massive corporate lab. They explicitly said they weren't in it for the money.
That was the narrative. But Howe argues that the nonprofit status was a strategic necessity to build an impenetrable moat. Think about it from a recruitment standpoint. If Google comes to the world's best machine learning researchers and says, come work for us so we can optimize ad click-through rates, a lot of them will pass. But if a nonprofit says, come work for us to build a safe digital god and save humanity, you get the absolute top-tier talent. They aggregated the world's best brains who would never have worked for a standard corporation. They solicited mission-aligned data from the public. They effectively got the entire world to lower its guard.
It was a recruitment hack.
It was a Trojan horse. Because once the talent and that massive data pipeline were locked in, they executed the pivot. In 2019, they created a capped profit entity. This is what allowed them to take billions of dollars from Microsoft. Howe argues this wasn't an accident or some sudden change of heart. It was a structural evolution that was necessary to access the capital required for total market dominance. You simply cannot build an empire on nonprofit donations. You need the capital markets. But you couldn't get the initial raw resources, the talent, and the public goodwill without that nonprofit shield. That is the imperial bait-and-switch.
So the argument is that the mission was never actually the end goal. The mission was just the customer acquisition strategy.
The mission was the marketing that allowed the empire to bypass regulatory scrutiny. But let's actually answer your challenge about colonial behavior. You asked for proof of imperialism. An empire fundamentally requires the uncompensated seizure of resources that do not belong to it. To explain how OpenAI does this, Howe uses the analogy of the 18th century Enclosure Acts in England.
This is the history lesson where wealthy landowners basically fenced off common land, right?
Correct. Before the Enclosure Acts, you had thousands of acres of common land where anyone could graze livestock or forage. It belonged to the community collectively. Then, the wealthy elite fenced it off, claimed it as private property, and literally forced the local populations to pay to work on the land they used to use for free. Howe argues OpenAI has performed a massive digital enclosure. They treat the entire internet, which is humanity's collective art, our text, our code, our history, as terra nullius. That's a colonial term for land belonging to no one.
But wait a second. Public data on the internet is, by definition, public. If I go to the local library and read every single book on the shelf, I'm not enclosing the library, I'm just learning from it. If I read a million blog posts, I learn how people write. Why is it theft or enclosure when OpenAI does it? Aren't they just reading really, really fast?
That is exactly the defense their lawyers use. But there is a massive structural distinction between reading and extraction. When you read a book, You don't strip the fundamental economic value from the author and sell a direct competing version of their own work back to them. Imagine if I went into that library you mentioned, physically took every single book, ground them all into pulp, and used that pulp to manufacture paper 2.0, and then I sold that new paper to everyone who used to visit the library for free. I haven't learned. I have seized the raw materials of the commons to create a proprietary commercial product.
So the core difference is the productization. You're taking collective input and turning it into a private commodity.
OpenAI systematically scrapes copyright-protected data without consent or compensation. In economic terms, this is primitive accumulation. They take our collective knowledge, refine it through their massive black box models, and then sell that refined intelligence back to the public. And this leads to what Hao calls the collapse of reproducibility. Scientific research basically devolves into PR-reviewed research because the actual training data, the raw material of the model, has to be kept completely hidden to protect the commercial product. They fenced off the digital cons, processed it, and are now charging us rent to access our own collective human intelligence.
I see the structural logic there, even if I struggle a bit with the morality of assigning theft to data scraping. It's undeniably a ruthless business model. But let me test this whole emperor theory against reality. If Sam Altman is this all-powerful imperial architect, why did his own board of directors fire him in November 2023? That weekend did not look like a calculated, masterful imperial strategy. It looked like absolute corporate chaos. The board had the legal power to remove him, and they did. Doesn't that explicitly prove the nonprofit governance structure was actually working the way it was supposed to?
That specific weekend is actually the strongest proof of the imperial thesis in the entire book. It perfectly exposes the concept of compute capture. Think about the mechanics of that weekend. It was chaotic, absolutely. The board had the legal authority, they held a vote, and Altman was out. On paper, the nonprofit governance won. But within 48 hours, that entire structure collapsed back in Altman's favor. Why? Because the board had no physical power. OpenAI's entire survival depended entirely on Microsoft's Azure infrastructure. We are talking about billions of dollars in dedicated GPU clusters. Without those physical chips running in the background, the company is literally just a group of panicked people with laptops.
Right, I remember that. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, immediately stepped in and publicly offered to hire Altman and the entire engineering team. He basically said, come to Microsoft, we have the actual servers.
Which would have instantly left the OpenAI board with a totally empty shell. The compute moat dictated the outcome. The investors, primarily Microsoft, and the employees, who were heavily incentivized by their own profit participation shares, not the nonprofit mission, forced the board's hand. The massive structural lesson of the 2023 coup is that legal governance is a complete fiction when your survival is totally dependent on an investor's hardware.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this compute capture idea, you can be the CEO, you can have the official charter, the title, the legal mandate, but if the guy who owns the power plant says, if you fire him, I'm turning off the lights, then the guy with the power plant is actually the one in charge.
Precisely. Capital and compute completely outweighed the nonprofit charter. The coup proved once and for all that the empire isn't the board of directors. The empire is the infrastructure. And this brings us to the core mental model Hao wants us to adopt moving forward, which is techno-feudalism.
Techno-feudalism. That sounds incredibly dystopian.
It is an accurate economic description. Under this model, you have to stop looking at the chatbot's answers and look at the owner's infrastructure. In techno-feudalism, users are not customers. We are serfs. We generate the data, which is our labor, for free. We post on forums. We write articles. We code open source projects. OpenAI encloses that uncompensated labor. We are then forced to pay rent, in the form of API fees and subscriptions, to access the intelligence derived from our own work. Just as the East India Company violently seized resources from the colonies to enrich the imperial center, OpenAI centralizes the world's decentralized knowledge into a proprietary black box owned by a handful of men in San Francisco.
It really is the magic crumbles moment. There's a great reference in the book to Joseph Weizenbaum, the MIT professor who created ELIZA, the very first chatbot in the 60s. He said that once the inner workings of a program are explained, the magic just crumbles away. And Hao is doing that here. She's aggressively shifting the view from AI as this helpful, magical tool to AI as a rent-seeking extraction machine.
And extraction really is the operative word, because the imperial model doesn't just extract data from the digital world. It extracts physical labor and natural resources from the fiscal world. This is where we hit the paradox of the Potemkin AI.
Potemkin refers to the fake, hollow villages built just to impress the Russian empress, right? An illusion of prosperity.
Yes. The Potemkin AI is the illusion of Autonomous, frictionless magic. You sit at your computer, you type a prompt, and the machine seemingly thinks. It feels clean and seamless. But Hao exposes the massive hidden supply chain of human misery required to maintain that illusion. It is absolutely not just silicon doing the work. The imperial model requires an underclass to function.
You're talking about the data labeling sweatshops. I've heard rumors about this, but give us the actual details. What did she uncover?
She reports extensively on the ghost work that makes the system viable. To make a model like ChatGPT commercially safe, to stop it from casually spewing hate speech, racism, or graphic violence, someone has to manually teach it what those concepts look like. You cannot just write an algorithm to detect human depravity. You need human trauma. OpenAI contracted workers in Kenya through an outsourcing firm called Sama, paying them roughly $2 an hour.
And their job was to manually review the darkest corners of the internet.
The absolute worst things humanity has ever produced. We were talking about workers subjected to mushroom clouds of sexual violence, extreme gore, bestiality, child abuse. These Kenyan workers had to read and view thousands of highly graphic snippets for 9 hours a day to label them as toxic. Also, the American model could learn what to filter out. Many of these workers were left permanently psychologically traumatized, with little to no meaningful mental health support.
And this is the sanitization process that allows the final product to be safely sold to corporate America. Because you obviously can't sell an enterprise chatbot to a Fortune 500 bank if it might spontaneously generate a racist manifesto.
Precisely. The civilized, enterprise-ready product completely depends on an exploited, traumatized underclass in the Global South. And the extraction doesn't stop at labor. It extends to essential physical resources. Wei details data centers in places like Chile, operated by infrastructure partners like Google and Microsoft, are extracting simply unfathomable amounts of water to cool their server farms.
Wait, in regions that are already dealing with severe drought conditions?
Yes. A single data center cluster can consume as much water as a small city. They're literally competing with local indigenous populations for basic survival resources, water and electricity, just to power compute cycles for a chatbot primarily used by affluent users in the West. That is the literal definition of imperial extraction. You are taking the critical, life-sustaining resources of the periphery to fuel the luxury and capital accumulation of the core.
Okay, I have to step in and play the geopolitical trump card here, because everything you just laid out is horrible. But this is the exact counter-argument I hear constantly from tech lobbyists and honestly from politicians in Washington. They say, look, even if everything you say is true, the uncompensated data scraping, the $2 an hour traumatized labor, the massive water consumption, isn't that just the necessary price of progress? Because if the United States doesn't build AGI first, won't an authoritarian regime like China do it? And if they do it first, doesn't that threaten the entire democratic world order? So isn't this aggressive imperial behavior actually a mandate for national security?
That is the exact binary argument Sam Altman wants you to make. It is a masterclass in deflection. Kama identifies this specific rhetorical strategy as the sci-fi shield.
The sci-fi shield.
Yes. It is the use of hypothetical future fear to justify present-day exploitation. Altman and other key figures in Silicon Valley constantly invoke these arms race narratives and Terminator-style extinction scenarios. That's what we call doomerism. They go to Washington and tell regulators, we have to scale at all costs, ignoring all red tape, or the authoritarian regimes will win. Or they say, we have to move fast and consolidate power, or the rogue AI will kill us all.
It creates a perfect binary trap. It frames it as us versus China, or humanity versus the machines. So if you criticize OpenAI's labor practices, you are somehow actively helping the enemy.
Exactly. The primary function of that geopolitical trap is to totally silence ethical oversight. If you convince the public that you are fighting for the literal survival of the species or the preservation of the Western world order, then labor law violations in Kenya or water rights in Chile suddenly seem like trivial complaints. The sci-fi shield weaponizes hypothetical future threats to completely distract regulators from the actual documented labor and environmental crimes happening right now.
So, by forcing everyone to focus on the existential risk of AGI, the robots taking over the world in 10 years, they get an absolute free pass on the existing risk of their business model today.
It effectively insulates them from the law. You cannot effectively regulate an entity that you genuinely believe is the only thing standing between you and the apocalypse. It allows them to position themselves not as a ruthless corporation, but as global saviors.
Man, that is deeply sobering. It reframes the entire industry narrative. So let's extract the practical insight here. If we accept this imperial framing as the reality, what changes for you and me? For the listener who just uses ChatGPT to debug code or summarize a long PDF, what are we supposed to do with this new structural awareness?
It requires a massive shift in what Howitt calls infrastructure literacy. We have to stop viewing AGI as some kind of public utility or an inevitable neutral scientific evolution. We have to start viewing it explicitly as a tool of capital accumulation.
Meaning we need to look at who is actually holding the bag at the end of the day.
It means understanding that the mission benefiting humanity is actually a mechanism designed to centralize resources. They are centralizing global talent, they are centralizing humanity's data, and they are centralizing the physical supply of silicon chips. The reason this matters right now is that we are willingly handing over the keys to human knowledge to a private entity that operates with zero democratic accountability.
And if the empire controls the underlying model, they inevitably control the truth.
They control the culture, the flow of information, and the digital economy. If this digital enclosure is permanent, we're moving toward a world of absolute dependency. This ties directly into the loss of agency. If you don't own the infrastructure, you don't own the output. You are just renting your own intelligence back from a sovereign corporate power.
And that ties perfectly back to Howe's synthesis on Sam Altman himself. Throughout this entire book, he doesn't just come across as a smart Silicon Valley CEO. He seems like something entirely different.
Howe deconstructs him not as a scientist, but as a power operator. She essentially frames him as a narrative alchemist.
A narrative alchemist. That is a brilliant way to phrase it.
Think about the deeply contradictory groups he has to keep aligned to maintain this empire. He needs venture capitalists who demand massive monopolistic financial returns. He needs the government, who demands national security dominance and fear-based control over competitors. And he needs the public, who desperately wants a utopian sci-fi future where AI cures cancer and no one has to work.
But those interests are entirely contradictory. You cannot have hyper-monopoly profit, total government oversight, and a socialist post-scarcity utopia all at the same time. Those arrows point in three completely different directions.
But Altman is the alchemist who blends them into a single narrative. He sits down with the VCs and says, this will be the most profitable company in human history. He goes to Capitol Hill and tells the government, this is a vital weapon for national defense against China. And he goes on podcasts and tells the public, this technology will usher in a universal basic income.
And the uncomfortable truth at the center of all of that is that the mission is not the goal.
The mission is the marketing. By keeping the ultimate goal intentionally vague and universally benevolent, benefiting humanity, he can justify literally any aggressive action taken to acquire more power. If he needs to scrape copyright data, it's for the mission. If he needs to orchestrate a board coup, it's for the mission. If he needs to drain a reservoir in the global south, it is for the mission.
It is a brilliant, if utterly terrifying, strategy. It aligns everyone's specific greed or fear into a singular focus that empowers OpenAI. I think I can actually explain this to someone else now. It's not just a lazy critique that OpenAI is greedy. It's a precise structural definition showing that they are replicating historical patterns of colonization. But the territory they are conquering isn't physical land, it's human intelligence.
That is exactly it. And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with this synthesis. We constantly spend our time asking, what will AI do to us? Will it take my job? Will it replace human art? Will it destroy us? But that is the wrong question. That is the exact question the empire wants you distracted by.
What is the question we should be asking?
The right question is, who owns the infrastructure? Because historically, whoever owns the infrastructure decides who gets to speak, who gets to work, and who gets to extract the profit. OpenAI is not the future of human intelligence. It is simply the latest iteration of global power extraction. We are watching the permanent enclosure of the human mind by a handful of men accountable to absolutely no one.
If you want more deep dives like this, subscribe to the channel. And think about this as you log off today.